We uh, we ask that you take the time to fill this out, and I'll turn it over to Aaron to introduce our speaker.
Hi, great. Thanks, James. Thank you for joining us, everyone, for our webinar today, Predatory Publishing, a practical and nuanced overview. We're very lucky to be joined by Monica Berger, professor, library, New York City College of Technology, City University of New York. Monica has published extensively on predatory and questionable publishing. Her monograph, Predatory Publishing, Global Scholarly Communications, was published by the Association of Research and College Libraries in 2024. Her publications and presentations, she addresses the marginalization of scholars from the Global South, arguing that quality, diamond open access, as well as reform of scholarly assessment are needed to mitigate predatory publishing. Berger believes that librarians play a critical role in user education by teaching authors how to think more critically about their publishing practices and practice due diligence. And I'll pass it off to Monica to get started with her presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you. So let's get this. Okay. So before I get started, I just want to mention I used to be an electronic resources and serials and cataloging librarian before I changed my functional position in 2015. So my whole journey with Predatory started because I was the journals expert at my college, and I was asked to at take a look at someone's CV. So here's an overview of today's workshop. We're gonna start with Mythbusters, and that's going to be like a fun little interactive thing using the chat where I'll ask some questions. We'll talk about harms, the definition of predatory, which is a really interesting topic, its characteristics, the language we use, the research, tips and tools, and a little more briefly, structural solutions, pedagogical solutions, and a conclusion. So in the blurb, I referenced this great article by Rick Anderson, and I'm hoping some of you read it because it really addresses the micro and the macro perspectives when it comes to scholarly communications and our roles as librarians. And it's something to sort of keep in mind as we go through this because I think our default is to think about the micro, about our campus, and we don't necessarily think enough about the macro, the global implications of what we do. And here is a screenshot of my book. And the gist of the book is how predatory publishing fits into the broad arc of scholarly communications. So let's get going with some of those mythbusters. These are true and false questions. Please go ahead and write into the chat. Question 1. Predatory journals do not conduct peer review. Okay. All right. Does anyone else need more time? Let me go ahead. So the answer is false. Although they submit anywhere between 80 to 100% of submissions, some, if not many, predatory journals actually do provide peer review. But the important thing, and I agree with Nicole, it's not proper peer review. It's peer review by their own authors who are folks who've had very slim publishing experiences, perhaps only with a predatory publisher or that predatory publisher. Okay, next one. Only inexperienced authors publish in predatory journals. Okay. All right. So, yep, that's another false myth. There definitely is a mix of author types that publish in predatory journals. In particular, not only people who choose them by mistake, experienced authors often use predatory journals for padding their CVs. And that falls into sort of a gray zone of misconduct. If, say, 80–90% of one's work is good and there are just a few extra articles thrown into pad. Okay, number 3, all predatory journals are open access. All right. So the response is sort of, but not entirely. And my explanation is even though many predatory journals say they're open access, they often require authors to transfer copyright. They're not thinking of open access as it's meant to be, but rather as a business model and as an excuse to get author fees. Um, Also, some predatory journals use memberships and subscription models as well. Okay, so here's that slide. Um, so yes, and we should note that legitimate open access journals may require copyright transfer too, but this is a very important little detail if you're ever helping an author deal with withdrawing their article. And the reason why is once you transfer copyright, your options as an author get very limited. Okay, only low quality journals suffer from cases of research misconduct, true or false? Okay. Okay. So to go ahead, yes, that's another false as well. I've been following Retraction Watch for about 10 years, and you will see that there's a tremendous amount of misconduct based at traditional prestigious publishers. So predatory is just one small piece of that picture. Okay. So next I'm going to talk about how predatory publishing harms different stakeholders, and we can start with authors who may publish accidentally in a predatory journal, and that article might actually be very good. And then those authors may have difficulties placing their article elsewhere because of duplicate publication. There are all manner of bad editorial experiences. To me, one of the worst things is that the research is effectively lost because it's so poorly disseminated and can't be discovered. Then there's reputational damage to the author, and at some institutions, loss of credit towards publication, or a requirement that the faculty member take that article off their CV. For institutions, the main harm is reputational harm. And then for funders, a waste of money, because again, these publications are not properly indexed and hard to discover. For patients and consumers, this is a very under-discussed topic and really important. Predatory publishing definitely has played a role in spreading misinformation, particularly in science, around topics like climate change and COVID and other really important health things. And predatory journals have been used for advocacy research, which is research that promotes a product or point of view. The reputation of open access has been hurt by predatory publishing. Unfortunately, folks continue to confuse predatory and open access even after this many years. And then the Global South thing is huge. So defining the Global South as formerly colonized countries and or less developed and lower middle income countries, the scholarship there is often impugned as predatory, whether you're talking about the publisher. Well, anyway, a lot of predatory publishing is based in the Global South, but we also just really don't know very much about the full scope of what's being published or written from the Global South because so much of it's not in English and outside of the outlets we know. So I want to point to this wonderful image from the Inter-Academy Partnership that points out that publication quality is very much on a spectrum from, very bad to low risk or high risk to low risk. I think it's a very important thing to keep in mind that we often think of predatory publishing as like a yes, no, black, white type of question, and that's not a good thing. I also want to bring back the Global South question. I would generally say, and it's a bold statement, but if a journal is low quality and it's from the Global South, we too often call it predatory. If it's from a mainstream Northern publisher, we give it a pass. Okay. So now I want to talk about definitions, and I would like to still go with this Ottawa Consensus definition, which was published in Nature. It's cited very often. It's not perfect, but it's really, to me, very helpful because it gets at how ambiguous and squishy predatory publishing is. So to read it quickly, predatory journals and publishers are entities that prioritize self-interest at the expense of scholarship and are characterized by false or misleading information, deviation from best editorial and publication practices, and a lack of transparency. And then in red, and or the use of aggressive and indiscriminate solicitation practices, which references spam rather. So the self-interest part is interesting because predatory journals almost always charge money, but they may be publishing for other reasons, perhaps in a sense functioning more like a vanity press for local faculty or friends of the publisher. The false and misleading information, a good example would be claiming you're in the directory of open access journals or DOAJ, but you're not. Deviation from best editorial and publication practices and lack of transparency. Predatory journals very deliberately obscure information about their staff, their publisher, their location, and so on. Um, Now, one thing that's interesting is that peer review is not addressed in this definition, and that was somewhat controversial, but peer review is something of a black box. So I want to end this section on the definition where have struggled with this whole thing about separating the deceptive from the lousy, meaning the poorly resourced and lower quality journals. And it's a really sticky wicket. Some argue that it doesn't matter because the outcome to all is basically the same, but not everyone agrees with that. And I took another look again at the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE's definition, and they draw that line, defining predatory as deceptive or fraudulent. So it's just really good to keep in mind that not everybody's exactly on the same page. So now I'm going to move on to characteristics. All right, so this is a little infographic I made. And this is kind of geared to authors, but um, I'm going to talk mostly about essentially heuristics, which overlap with characteristics. Heuristics are surface level signs and signals that we look for. Um, and really, ultimately, as you move up that pyramid, the ideal thing is to really read the content and engage people who are experts to truly judge the quality of a journal. Um, those mental shortcuts we call heuristics can't substitute for close examination. And I'll quote from a wonderful article, Behavior and Practice of Predatory Journals. You really need to engage with the content. So most familiar characteristic is spam, the unsolicited emails, overly familiar tone, fast turnaround may include the title of a recent publication. So I just want to share an example of one that I got. So how do they do this? They scrape Google Scholar, and that's become very um, common. So just an early tip, I'll do a whole section on tips towards the end. Look for contradictions. You will see different names and other details even within that spam email. And that's because this stuff is done through automation. There's no human being writing you. Okay. Um, for all of us who are mostly librarians, the poor dissemination and poor user experience is so critical. Inadequate editorial processes, predatory journals are not in library bibliographic databases and indexes, lacking, the editorial stuff will lack adequate peer review and copy editing. There's a lack of transparency around who the publisher is and the fees. And the copycat names are like also a very loud signal. And I'll show you kind of a fun example that if you search Journal of High Energy Physics, you can find a predatory journal that just tacked on a subtitle. Yeah. So more about false and misleading information. The editorial board members are so often not real editorial board members, and people's names and headshots are appropriated. Look for unclear information about where they are based. Often publishers will just name uh, their country, which is kind of a really loud screaming signal. The false claims, again, predatory publishers will claim they're members of different editorial organizations when they're not. They'll claim they have a journal impact factor or a fake type of journal impact factor. They'll claim to be leading. Fake claims about indexing in PubMed or DOAJ. And deception about location is super common, that journals that are actually based in the South are claim that they're based in the US or Canada or somewhere else in the north. All right. More deviations from best editorial practices. The lack of a Creative Commons license is somewhat common, although I do see it on predatory journals often enough. The lack of proper indexing, as I mentioned earlier, there are no policies related to retractions or conflict of interest. Again, poor copy editing, plagiarism control, and websites that use templates and may be loaded with grammatical errors and are otherwise very unprofessional. And they're really geared to attracting authors, not geared to readers. The lack of transparency is most concerning around author fees. But again, publisher information is often obscured. So predatory conferences in brief, they're real money machines because often the publishers tie the conference fees to a separate fee for publishing in a journal or some kind of, whatever collection of papers attached to the conference. There's very quick turnaround in terms of responses to those. And I guess one major thing, which is common sense, is that these conferences are not affiliated with professional associations, universities, colleges, or institutes. This tool, Think, Check, Attend, is very good. Let me go back. Okay, so there are other types of journals and publishers that are sort of adjacent to predatory, which I'll kind of quickly cover. Hijack journals essentially impersonate legitimate journals, which are typically defunct. And Retraction Watch has a very useful journal checker tool. Paper mills are like a hot topic, and they're essentially pay-to-play operations for low quality, flawed authorship, and it's for sale by third-party operators. They've really proliferated. And they occur at mainstream journals as well as predatory. A very interesting topic are what are called gray area journals and publishers. And those would be Frontiers, MDPI, and formerly Hindawi, which I believe has been dissolved by Wiley. And these are big, newer, open access publishers that have been accused of lowering their standards, and that's where they get described as gray area. From what I've read, it's often more of an individual journal problem than a publisher-wide problem. And this stuff is reported in Retraction Watch constantly. But a lot of it has to do with actually, let me just skip the next thing I was going to say. It's not that important. So abuse of special issues is something that these gray area publishers have been accused of doing, but mainstream publishers do that too. And it's self-helping, self-serving, where often an editor might benefit from the special issue by publishing in it themselves and so on. But special issues are another concern. All right. The language. Many people find the term predatory offensive, including many librarians, and the term does not really consider authors or journals that have no ill intentions. So some other people use the word questionable. And of course, the terms blacklist and whitelist can be quite controversial. It's not surprising that, and I can never say it right, Cabels has rebranded their products. So I'm not going to go on too much about it, but there's a whole discussion just about the language aspects of predatory. So now this slide got a little messed up. This slide is, why does predatory publishing exist? So essentially, it arose as online publishing platforms like OJS, Open Journal System, became easily available. And then the advent of article processing charges, or APCs, also became a thing in the aughts. So some predatory publishers would publish anything if they were paid. And it was very common for people to essentially sting or hoax these journals by sending them either gibberish or ridiculous articles to prove that these publishers would publish anything. And one of my favorites is a new one called "What's the Deal with Birds?" And that is a image from that article. Um, Let me go back. So another reason why predatory arose, the why behind predatory, is just really that publish or perish has really accelerated competition um, amongst different universities globally has just accelerated. And suddenly all these institutions that were never part of this competition threw their hat in the ring. So all this intensification has resulted in a lot of haste um, on the end of not only authors, but evaluators. Overproduction of outputs, again, resulting in poor scholarly assessment. Um, and the international competition for university rankings ties into publication outputs in English language journals. And typically, predatory journals are English language. There are some exceptions, but I won't get into that. And these pressures are really particularly onerous in the global South, where there are a lot less resources. And publishing requirements really differ from country to country. Some countries use journalists. Um, for example, India and China have their own lists of journals that authors need to publish in. India's lists have proven to be very controversial. Um, Publishing is done a lot by graduate students in lieu of a dissertation. I just found out when I was preparing for this talk that India finally got rid of its requirement that graduate students had to publish articles, which combined with India's journalist, which is, well, I'm not saying I know, but was described as flawed, had a very negative effect. And another area where there's been an explosion of predatory publishing is Indonesia, which has launched many low quality um, new open access journals. And that has to do, apparently, or may have to do with Indonesia wanting to rise up in these university rankings, but otherwise to compete more on the world scene. Another reason why predatory persists is that there are a lot of authors, particularly in the South, who are really afraid of mainstream journals. They don't want to be rejected, or they just feel alienated from Northern publishers. CV padding is eternal. Um, Publishing in English language is considered much more prestigious or maybe required, particularly in some of these global South countries. And a lot of institutions don't have proper policies to address predatory, and funders do not necessarily follow up on where their money goes in terms of publications funded by grants. So the research in brief, so many new articles on predatory publishing. And there's a lot of difficulty in doing the research. And that ties into how you conceptualize predatory publishing. Um, so the question is, what's your data source if you're doing empirical research? Is it Beale's list? Is it cables? Are you looking at spam messages? Are you just looking at Omics, which is the world's largest predatory publisher, and we feel safe calling them predatory because they were successfully sued by the FTC. There's no ambiguity. How are you defining predatory? Deceptive, deceptive in low quality, etc. Right? So the publishers. So as I said before, they are chiefly located in the global south. Very important to know that they may use rebranding and name changes to elude detection. It's like the same business with the editor information being very lacking. Um, predatory publishers do a lot of tricky things to avoid detection. So Omics went and rebranded a whole fleet of journals. And the number of publishers has been reported differently from study to study. Cable's list is now officially up to almost 20,000 journals or more. There was a very interesting discussion about Cable's press release on the Open Cafe listserv a few days ago. A little about APCs. They are significantly lower than those of mainstream publishers, although some of that can be disciplinary. I haven't really found very recent research on that topic. And then an interesting tidbit is that a researcher found that Omics actually put ghostwritten articles into its journals to sort of internally pad their own journals. So that's kind of interesting to create this sort of illusion of more content. So here is a little more about authors. So they're not just graduate students, but there's a lot of discussion in the literature about early career researchers by David Nicholas of CIBER, who's done all this longitudinal research. And they did another study about predatory more recently. And it's really kind of a mixed bag, but one can kind of say that early career researchers are very cautious about where they publish. Many authors pad their CVs, and there may be repeat offenders in that regard. So it's not just like the accidental person. And the speedy publication drives a lot of authors. I found a tremendous amount of literature in the biomedical and health related areas. So that's an area where there are a lot of not just publishers, but authors. So interestingly, and it's an old study, it is almost 10 years old, but when you look at mower Stop This Waste of People, Animals, and Money, they found, and this is just for biomedical journals, that, after India, the most authors were in the United States, and many of them were like at very elite institutions. So it's very helpful. And let's see. Another thing is that a study of 2,200 plus omics authors found that many were from the South and were early career. Authors continue to report reprehensible behavior on the part of the publishers, including demands to play APCs twice, harassment, intimidation, and bullying. Articles were published without author consent. And I want to conclude by mentioning Serhat Kurt's article. He's a Turkish scholar who did some qualitative research on authors in the South and predatory publishing, and it really does get into a very different perspective of authors, how they are, many of them are kind of terrified of Northern publishers. It's an old article too, but it's really good. Okay, so editors and peer review. Many of the editors in chief work for the publisher. If not, they're authors who've published repeatedly with the journal, or they could be made up names. I recently came across a predatory journal that listed my colleague as an editor in chief, which was kind of shocking. And some editors in chief are CV padding. And there is this article and related thing, the Dr. Fraud sting, if you want to read more about, uh, editors and predatory journals and what they do. Peer review, the peer reviewers tend to have a similar profile to authors. They tend to be early career, very little publishing, and from the global south. Okay. This is a really interesting area. Citations of predatory journal articles are, you can see 57% have never been cited, but concerning almost 25% have been cited up to 10 times. And a more recent article by Watson and Zhang found that 32% of articles published in a group of uh, medical journals were cited by mainstream journals indexed in Web of Science. So the problem is just how these predatory articles can kind of filter into the literature. And they found a tenfold increase in the citation of these journals over the last 9 years. And also coercive citation, when the publisher tells you to cite their journal or their publisher, is another aspect of predatory that was recently in a study. So this is the Strensol study of lists, and it just proves that there's some overlap between different lists. Mind you, it's old. I mean, DOHA and cables went through various, changes and evolutions over the years. A more recent large study by Richtig found that Beale's list was lacking. And I just want to conclude the discussion of lists that authors love lists because they're convenient and expedient, as do evaluators. Okay, so now I'm going to get into some tips and tools for librarians. Um, you know, great tools, cables, DOHA, DOHA's list of deceptive journals, ANAIN, which is the nursing editorial organization, has great resource material for authors, but also a whitelist. But using lists can impede critical thinking. Then there are all kinds of rubrics out there as well. And checklists like the Raleigh, I'm not saying her name correctly, Raleigh, R-E-L-E et al.'s journal evaluation tool. They're really complicated, but they're very in-depth. So some people may not have the patience to use them. I personally really like Think, Check, Submit, and I like Compass to Publish too. I finally spent some time with it. The difference is that Think, Check, Submit, you're not actually, it's up to you to kind of look at things on your own. Compass to Publish actually is interactive, where you can, put in your journal and then answer a series of questions, and it gives you a score. It's good to know that publishers all have journal matcher tools. There's also Jane, which is agnostic. There are AI tools. There was an article in Nature really recently about an open source tool by Zhuang et al. The PKP Publications Fact Label is very charming. It's going to be a plugin in OJS, and they're still working on it, but I think it's very cool. Okay, so do-it-yourself tips for the librarian. I generally quickly always check to see if a journal is open access, is it in DOHA? Any journal, is it in Web of Science? Is it in Scopus? Indexes are super important if the journal is in STEM. So, I'll check that along with other bibliographic indexes. Index Copernicus is always a red flag. Let's see, and I want to mention that Scopus is not perfect. I'm not like an expert on this, but I believe the issue is that they did not remove journals or remove items that were indexed retroactively. So once they became concerned about a certain journal, they excluded it from Scopus, but the older stuff lingers. Also regarding bibliographic databases, PubMed is much more selective. PubMed Central is much more selective than PubMed. That's kind of a really good thing to keep in mind. So some other things to look for, as I mentioned earlier, are contradictions between, the spam message within the website, out of scope invitations, out of scope content, unprofessional websites, overuse of those templates, the use of too many logos of indexes and databases, and the use of forms for submission, poor author guidelines. And there's just a lot of due diligence to judging journals. So I really do recommend just look at the journal and the publisher as carefully as you can, including doing some reading. And well, let's say if it's single or double blind peer review, predatory journals generally don't have that kind of detail. And again, are the author fees clear? Although I would say that last item is not quite as, I don't know, a lot of predatory publishers are actually very clear about author fees. All right. So another quick tip is if the journal is open access, are they members of OASPA or are they members of COPE, which is a really important organization for all publishers, not just open access? And then look at the disciplinary editorial organizations. Are they members? Cross-check these things. A lot of predatory journals will say they're members of WAME or not. So, I want to mention before I move on that COPE has great guidance on all things editorial, but including how to withdraw an article from a predatory journal, as well as that duplicate publication issue with a predatory journal. So now moving towards the end, let's talk a little bit about structural issues. So if you really want to understand these broader problems in academia and science, let me start over again, understand how these problems that are more broader in scholarly communications play a role in predatory publishing, do read my book. There was a new article by Amelia Kazmarek, who kind of makes a lot of the same points, and all these resources are in the handouts you'll get. The biggest problem really is weakness in scholarly assessment because there's overproduction of content. Reviewers don't and can't actually read. Peer reviewers are overburdened, and some solutions are narrative CVs and selective CVs. There's significant discussion about reforming scholarly assessment and many declarations. And I won't get into those, but DORA and CORA which is a European initiative, are both excellent resources to kind of dig into their recommendations for changing things. And they essentially argue that bibliometrics like journal impact factor are overvalued, and we know they're frequently gamed. There's a lot of weakness in how universities and funders respond to predatory publishing, and this is all really complicated by how many journals fall into a gray area. Open peer review. Okay. It's very promising for revealing predatory publications. When I first came upon the notion of open peer review as a solution for predatory, I thought, well, that's it. But I'm not really sure how much traction that idea has taken on. It certainly would be open reviews would be very helpful to evaluators judging faculty. Diamond open access, however, I think is really important for us to understand that as librarians and even vendors, that there just aren't enough journals to um, help all the people who need to publish. And when you create Diamond Open Access journals, you can create a journal that just serves the needs of your local audience or your local academics. You can do regional publishing. You don't have to publish in English. You have a lot more freedom to provide that. Now, of course, there are huge questions about English language publishing and how people can read each other and translation and so on. I don't want to get into that, but I do want to point to the Latin American publishing cooperative model, which I think is really successful. And, yes, it is funded by governments and universities and other NGOs and so on, but it really has presented an excellent alternative. So Diamond free to author open access really, I think, would certainly attract some of the authors who end up in predatory journals. Now, crowdsourcing, there's reviews, the Journal of Journal Reviews, which is kind of newish. It's interesting. It's essentially deep dives on individual journals, but that is another approach. So I'm going to end talking a little bit about pedagogical solutions. There are really three types: the things you do yourself, tutorials, think, check, submit, workshops, and one-on-one consultations. So I would argue that learning how to publish well is equally, if not more important than learning how to avoid predatory publishers. Graduate students are a critical group. Many lack scholarly communications knowledge and skills, but a lot of seasoned faculty need training too. Um, I believe that if you're going to do workshops, they should be contextualized within broader training related to publishing and research skills. The integrative approach is better. I find it also, I've learned from experience covering, finding the target journal and predatory within one workshop is a lot, and you'd want to have either 1.5 hours or maybe two workshops, and remind authors to use library databases for their literature review. I think a lot of authors stumble on predatory journals because they're using Google for their lit review. Consultations and training. I think subject liaisons have a huge role to play, and whether or not they partner with Scalcom librarians, both are good. I really like consultations because they're one-on-one, and I think most folks who are worried about predatory publishing don't want to announce it in front of everyone else. So the one-on-one consultations are great. So it's really important to help authors find target journals, especially early in their process, not like after they're done writing and ready to submit. Um, and I think using Web of Science or Scopus is also super helpful. I found this old article by Knight and Steinbach, really nice and clear about the 5 aspects of finding a target journal. And we want to think about journal visibility and potential article impact, because let's face it, authors want to be cited, right? And then the philosophical and ethical issues, right, are also important. And open access is a philosophical and ethical issue. So, and librarians as authors, yes, they're predatory journals in library science. All of the stuff I just said applies to you. So to conclude, the issue is really balancing the local versus the global. So we all want to help our authors, but we want to also help all authors and all readers. So as we say to our students when we teach, there are no wrong answers. So consider your role regarding authors in the South who very much need training and support for their publishing. They need alternatives. Diamond open access for more authors, removing financial barriers, Library publishing or scholar-led publishing very much needs your support for best practices. That is really important. And closer to home, can you encourage reform of scholarly assessment, if nothing else, through giving workshops? The CV patterns in those desperate to meet publication quantities feel predatory as well. Can you get your colleagues to reflect more deeply about their values related to publishing? How do you, as a librarian, educate your users to think more critically about their publishing and other aspects of scholarly communications? Remember the philosophical and ethical issues in the last slide. Ask yourself and the authors you support to reflect on values. Why publish and what is most important? Our choices can make a difference. I'll leave you with that thought. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. That was wonderful. If anyone has any questions, please put them into the Q&A panel. We're happy to also take any reflections. Monica's welcomed reflections to anything she said in the chat, and we're happy to bring those there. You're getting many thanks and applause, Monica. I did have a thought, maybe just to get us going while others think about what they might want to ask you, but building off of what you mentioned of what we can do in the library, and I'm speaking from a collections perspective, but I'm thinking about those journals and maybe publishers that are borderline predatory, where they fall into a lot of that criteria, but they may not be so obvious, and what to do when they approach institutions for things such as APC discounts or institutional agreements. And at one level, there are a lot of graduate students publishing with these, and those are often the stakeholders at the university that have the least amount of funding available to go to APCs. So the library creating that discount is a huge help, but where's the line between that and professional values in terms of supporting these borderline publishers and upholding a system that we may not professionally hold as true?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really hard one. I mean, and I would still say again with these gray area journals, um, I think they can be very much, uh, a case by case thing. I think, I always strike a very gentle balance between um, just doing what I think will make authors happiest, whether we're talking about graduate students or faculty, and getting them to be somewhat aware of possible negatives. So I think a lot of institutions are concerned about these gray area publishers. I mean, I've gotten a lot of questions from colleagues here about being approached, being spammed by some of these gray area publishers. And I'm not, again, I would say just dig into who the editor-in-chief is and, who's on the editorial board of the specific journal and get advice from more seasoned people because not all, as I said, it's a journal by journal thing. I don't know if that kind of answers your question.
It's more of a reflection. I think it's a gray area
Yeah,
where it's an
no,
institution and
no.
researcher decision.
Well, I mean, that's where, the cyber research is so interesting that a lot of early career researchers just want journals with excellent reputations. And maybe until you have tenure, one should be more conservative. And these are the kinds of things we want to reflect on as, when we work with folks.
Yeah, that's great. We do have some questions in the chat. I'll read the first one. How has AI affected predatory publishing in terms of perpetuating it or identifying predatory practices?
It's kind of interesting. I believe, and this is not my area of expertise, I need to spend more time with it. AI is definitely being used to generate papers for paper mills because it's it's a little different than predatory publishing. Most of what I come across is more about using AI to detect predatory publishing. But I'm not really sure. Um, I don't even know if predatory publishers are using AI, except maybe for spamming, but I have no idea. I mean, if there is something out there, I don't think I know about it. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Does that answer the question well
I
enough?
think I think that does, and yeah, feel free to ask a follow-up question
But there's like a
that
whole
effect.
cadre of people trying to use AI to, and large language models to actually, you know, help identify predatory publishers and low quality publishers.
For sure.
Yeah,
We've got another one here. We've got two more. We'll see if we have time for them both. So this
sure.
next one says, when you said these journals show up more in Google as opposed to library databases, does that include Google Scholar? Is Google Scholar no good at detecting these predatory journals?
Uh, um, it's there's no vetting process. I don't believe so. I do think Google Scholar may pick up predatory publications, but I'm not certain about that. But I would just say because there's vetting going on at library databases, and of course, none of these are perfect. None are perfect, but at least when there is actually some vetting going on, that's really the way to go. I mean, um, if you don't know the publishers and then you're using Google Scholar, you're going to be lost as an author, right? So that's where, at least if you're using a library database, and I'm throwing in Web of Science and Scopus into that bundle, you're in a good position. So I would kind of flip that on its head. Maybe someone else here knows the secret sauce of being indexed in Google Scholar, but I don't know how much they closely vet what they do index.
And there's more of a comment here, which is really apt. While copyediting problems and poor website quality have been strong signals in the past for predatory detection, this is likely to become less useful as more predatory sites use AI tools to produce more
Yeah.
polished text and less formatting
Well,
and the
that would be
like.
common sense, right? But we all know that there are different ways that text can signal that it was generated by AI, right? So that's a very interesting observation, but that makes absolute sense. And then you have all these tortured translations, right?
Of course.
Yes. So,
Well, yes.
so are you,
Anyways, that brings us to the end of the questions that we have, and I haven't found anything in the chat, and we're just at the hour, so I think
okay.
we might be in a place to call it. So I'll thank everyone so much for joining us, and their time and attention, and I'll just see if I can do this
Yes.
one
Thank
quick thing.
you.
Of course.
Thank
And I'll just
you.
let everyone know that the slides and resources that Monica mentioned will be shared in the follow-up email as well as an evaluation survey I've sent here. We do have a webinar on March 14th or March 24th, apologies, on usage metrics for AI, OA, and more with Tasha of Counterfame. And we hope to see everyone there. And thank you very much, Monica, for your wonderful presentation.
No, thank you. Right. I'm going to stay on for
Sounds
just a
good.
moment as people sign off. Okay. I see a few libraries tuned in.